Well, thank you so much, Tom. Tom can back me up on this because we both studied with Neil Postman, and really Neil was a great teacher on so many fronts, but among them was on public speaking. And Neil himself was an exceptional public speaker, and he was also very much a severe critic of public speaking and people who didn't do it all that well, and had several rules that he imparted to us on what not to do in public speaking. And I have to say that I'm going to break two of these rules tonight, and I'm going to apologize to you and to him for doing that. And one of the rules that I'm breaking is to get to your talk right away and not waste time on preliminary remarks. You know, at best, I think it was 30 seconds, he said, and get right to it. And I'm going to, and I've always just gone right into my talk, but I figure I've saved up enough preliminary time that I can use it tonight. But his point was that audiences can only take so much funkfering around, but tonight I'm going to funkfer a little bit, and the other rule of Postman's that I'm going to break is to never use visual aids, and that's something that I generally don't do, and one of the reasons is that it requires technology, and technology sucks, right? It certainly has a way of breaking down when we most rely on it, and all too often it takes a long time just to get it working, which translates to even more funkfering around than anyone ever imagined. I know if anything goes wrong, Postman's going to be up there looking down and laughing at me and saying, "I told you so." But the other reason to never use visual aids that he had was because he wanted our presentations to be about human presence, not technological mediation, about the human voice, not something projected on a screen, and about our words, not our images. So I agree with him for the most part, but again, tonight I'm going to make an exception. And in doing that, and something else that Tom and I share is that we both were students of and teaching assistants for Gary Gumpert at Queens College, and part of that entailed working with this old medium that many of you probably never heard of called multi-image, which was the slideshow extravaganza with tons of slide projectors across multiple screens as a big multimedia production. And that was a very interesting kind of experience, and I want to acknowledge that through that and through working with Gary Gumpert, I did learn something about visual aesthetics, and I want to acknowledge my debt to Gary Gumpert as well. And while I'm acknowledging debts, I also want to mention Postman's colleague and close friend and my dissertation advisor, Christine Nystrom. I know that if Postman's up there and starts laughing at me, Chris is going to keep him in line about that. Chris was the mother of media ecology. She was a brilliant thinker and teacher and really taught me everything I know about being a scholar. And along with that, I do want to also say that Walter Ong who I never got to meet, but I did correspond with him, does serve as a model for me for scholarship. But I want to make one more acknowledgement. Last month, Jack Barwin passed away. And I think most of you don't know if you know him. A few of you may know him from attending MEA conventions previously, but I knew him first and foremost as my teacher, at first semester of freshman year at Cornell University, taking as an elective Introduction to Communication Theory. And in that course, I was introduced to Marshall McLuhan and Harold Innes and Jacques Ellul and Daniel Boorstin and general semantics and systems theory and all kinds of other really interesting stuff. And when it turned out that my plans to major in biology and go on to medical school didn't quite turn out so well, I became a communication major, took more courses with him, and really that led me down the path from there to Queens College for my master's, to NYU and Neil Postman for my PhD, to Fordham, and to starting MEA, and to being here tonight. So I want to dedicate this talk to my first media ecology professor, Jack Barwind. And I hope you'll bear with me. I have a little bit more fumfering around to do, because I just want to explain that the original version of this talk goes back to 2010, was presented at a conference for the Institute of General Semantics, and it's before that audience, I decided to do a talk that, I mean, they're not an academic group per se, so I wanted to do something that was not specifically academic, and but intellectually stimulating. Something a little more playful and poetic and spiritual, appealing to the human potential movement folks in that group. And I also have this vision of how to do a talk with PowerPoint that I'd never had before. I had never done a PowerPoint before, and it just kind of all came together for me. So I've presented a few more times since then, but for MEA I went back and made some changes because this is the most important audience of all, as far as I'm concerned. But I just want to confess that when I heard that I would be getting an award for scholarship here, I really started to second guess myself, because I started thinking maybe I should present something heavier, more research-oriented, more philosophical kind of stuff Corey likes. Something more scholarly. But I figured, well, maybe we can save that for another time. Convention's just getting started after all. And anyway, if we did whatever people expected us to do, we wouldn't be media ecologists. So with that, I'll thank you for your patience with my fumfering around. And Corey, if you wouldn't mind getting the lights for me. Okay, the title of my talk is If Not A, Then E. Alfred Korzybski introduced general semantics in 1933 with the publication of Science and Sanity, which was subtitled An Introduction to Non-Aristotelian Systems and General Semantics. Now, he referred to systems in the plural because general semantics is not the only such system. It's one of many possible non-Aristotelian systems. And it's important to note that Korzybski was not opposing everything that Aristotle stood for, but rather that he was specifically concerned with Aristotle's logic, with the mode of thought that it represented, and especially with the way that others had used it over the centuries. And Korzybski explained that Aristotelian logic is perfectly valid when applied as a special case. But for most of human affairs, what we need is a non-Aristotelian mode of thought, just as scientists have adopted non-Newtonian physics, and mathematicians have embraced non-Euclidean geometries. Now, the term non-Aristotelian has sometimes been abbreviated as non-A or null-A, or symbolized by the letter A with a line or bar over it. I just want to mention that big one on the bottom was based on a design by Valerie Peterson. And really that's just another way of saying not A. And to move for a moment from A to B, not is a term that's used as an operator in Boolean logic, which is a post-Aristotelian logic introduced by George Boole in the 19th century. and in turn employed by Claude Shannon in the 20th century as he developed information theory. Now, not is also a term used by S.I. Hayakawa in his famous definition of general semantics, that it's the study of how not to make a damn fool of yourself. Now, reconciling Hayakawa with Korzybski, and we might well define general semantics as how not to make an ass out of you and me. But I digress. According to Boolean logic, not A would encompass everything in the universe that is not Aristotle's logic, which would include general semantics, the semiotics of Charles Sanders Peirce, the new criticism of I.A. Richards, Alfred North Whitehead and Bertrand Russell's theory of logical types, Ludwig Wittgenstein's concept of language games, Suzanne Langer's philosophy of symbolic form, Norbert Wiener's cybernetics, Gregory Bateson's systems theory, and media ecology as formally introduced by Neil Postman. But the world of not A would also include socks, penguins, quarks, cell phones, New Zealand, and everything from milkshakes to the Milky Way, including the proverbial kitchen sink. In other words, the set of everything but Aristotle's logic is much too broad a category to be of much use to us. And you might say that Korzybski was begging the question of what then? That is, if not A, then what? And in posing the question, I would note that if-then statements are common features of the computer programming languages introduced in the 20th century, which are based on 19th century Boolean logic. Now at this point, I'd like to turn to another seminal thinker from the field of media ecology for one possible answer to this question, and that scholar is Marshall McLuhan. McLuhan would explain that Aristotle and the system of logic that he codified were products of a culture that had been radically transformed by the introduction of the Greek alphabet. To provide a brief and cursory summary, the alphabet introduced a mode of communication based on the symbolic transformation of spoken words into visual records. This encouraged the separation of the knower from the known, allowing the products of the mind to be viewed and reviewed, providing the critical distance that brings with it a measure of objectivity and objectification. Reading and writing also requires a measure of isolation, encouraging new forms of individualism. Writing takes discourse out of its concrete situation in space and time, and its specific relationships between living, breathing human beings. And this decontextualization opens the door to high-level abstractions and abstract thinking. This also provides an emphasis on analysis, and the alphabet provides the model whereby utterances may be broken down to the basic units we call letters. That model led to the notion that all matter may be broken down into atoms, which was introduced by the pre-Socratic philosophers known as Ionian physicists. And the alphabet brings with it a perspective that is linear and sequential. The basis of a logic that says if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. In other words, Aristotelian logic. So if A is for alphabet, what then is not A? Looking backwards, we might point to orality, as in Walter Ong's key work, Orality and Literacy. But what Korzybski called non-Aristotelian would today be better understood as post-Aristotelian. And since orality is associated with a mode of thought that would be pre-Aristotelian, the answer we're looking for is not the big O. Instead, we can understand that with 10,000 years of orality, followed by a few thousand years of literacy, we now occupy a new period in human history based on the technological innovation of electricity. Indeed, McLuhan argued that the period of over 2 millennia of the alphabetic culture that defined the West has come to an end, replaced by the age of the electric circuit, electrical technology, and the electronic media. And given our penchant for alphabetic abbreviation, it's altogether fitting that for some time now we've been using the letter E to stand for electronic, for the products of computer technology such as email, e-commerce, e-business, e-banking, and those e-books that have caused so much agita in the publishing industry. We might well add to this list a term such as e-world to represent our electronic media environment. And so McLuhan gives us the answer to the question Korzybski posed, the answer being, if not A, then E. But if Aristotle is the face of alphabetic thought, who would best represent electric consciousness? Now, if we wanted to stay with the ancient Greeks, the answer might well be one of those Ionian physicists, Heraclitus. Heraclitus was well thought of by Korzybski for his early understanding of the concept of change and the dynamic nature of reality, which is summed up by his famous observation that you can never step into the same river twice. And while he was an atomist, he argued that it was fire that was the most basic element of all things, and fire, unlike air, water, and earth, is not a form of matter, but rather a dynamic process of transformation. I would also add that electricity at that time was thought to be a form of fire, later referred to as St. Elmo's fire. In addition to his natural philosophy, Heraclitus emphasized the importance of logos, a Greek word that refers to language, logic, and reason alike. And speaking of Greek, while the name Heraclitus begins with an H, the letter H in our Roman alphabet comes from the Greek letter that it looks like an H, but it's actually a vowel called eta. So the name in Greek, his name in Greek, would be better translated as Heraclitos, an appropriate name for our E-world. But even with this revised spelling, Heraclitus is too far removed from the electric age to serve as an appropriate symbol for us. And when it comes to the modern discovery of electricity and electric technologies, quite a few candidates come to mind, such as Benjamin Franklin, who caught lightning in a bottle, Luigi Galvani, who experimented on electrical stimulation of the body, Mary Shelley, who imagined the possibilities of electricity as life force, André-Marie Ampère, who discovered electromagnetism, Michael Faraday, who invented the electric generator, Samuel Morse, who invented the electrical telegraph, James Clerk Maxwell, who established the existence of electromagnetic fields, Heinrich Hertz, who discovered radio waves, Guglielmo Marconi, who's the inventor of the wireless, J.J. Thomson, who discovered the electron, and Nikola Tesla, whose many inventions include alternating current. But perhaps the individual who most powerfully symbolizes electricity in the public mind, and whose last name happens to begin, appropriately enough, with an E, is the Wizard of Menlo Park, Thomas Alva Edison. Edison's connection also harkens back to orality as the inventor of the phonograph, but he's best remembered for the electric light, also known for the kinetoscope, which made motion picture projection feasible. But as much as he was identified with light, Edison had a dark side and was severely lacking in ethics. So he's not the best choice to represent our new E-world. At this point, I turn back to Korzybski and consider the individual who inspired him to develop his non-Aristotelian system, the scientist most closely associated with non-Newtonian physics and non-Euclidean geometry, Albert Einstein. Although Einstein was not associated with electricity per se, McLuhan did identify him with the new way of thinking characteristic of the electric age, one in which the old linear and mechanistic view of space and time was superseded by a new emphasis on discontinuities and relativities. Einstein, of course, was famous for, among other things, an equation, specifically E equals mc squared, which stands for energy equals mass times the square of the speed of light. And what that equation drives home is an idea that was building over the course of the 19th century, the idea that energy is the basic stuff of the universe, that everything in the universe is a form of energy, even matter. And much of this understanding begins with the study of heat, giving rise to the laws of thermodynamics, and that brings us back to Heraclitus. But heat, electricity, electromagnetism, light, sound, and the atomic, all are forms of energy, so we can replace electricity with energy as the more inclusive term for our E-world. Now, energy was very much at the heart of Korzybski's thinking, because Korzybski was an engineer, and as an engineer, he was concerned with work, which requires power, which requires energy. Korzybski began his development of a non-Aristotelian system by introducing his taxonomy of classes of life. First, there was chemistry binding plant life being based on chemical energy. Then space binding animal life being based on, hey Val.
Yeah.
Grace Peterson is online. Oh, there we go. It's Valerie's computer, right?
My mom.
Hi, Mom.
Sorry, Mom.
Should I answer? Okay, so there was space binding animal life based on kinetic energy, and then time binding human life based on a kind of potential energy that we might call temporal energy. That's the ability to store and preserve knowledge, to build on past discoveries, and make progress. Now, the first law of thermodynamics expresses what's known as the conservation of energy, that energy cannot be created or destroyed, it can only change in quality and form. The second law of thermodynamics states that energy in a closed system will tend to lose its quality over time, moving towards a greater state, a state of increasingly greater disorder, randomness, and chaos, or entropy. Things fall apart, noise invariably interferes with communication, signals degrade, there's always something lost in transmission or translation. No matter how much time we spend cleaning house, after a while it only gets messy again. And as Aristotle himself would put it, all men are mortal. We're born and gestate through a process of differentiation. And that miraculous feat of organization breaks down and disintegrates when life comes to an end. But entropy is not all bad, and as absolute order would represent a frozen stasis, that would be just as bad and just as dead as absolute chaos. The phrase "on the edge of chaos" has come into use to explain the ways in which systems move from states of lesser to greater complexity, going against the grain of the second law of thermodynamics. The injection of a bit of entropy in the form of random mutation, for example, or the roll of genetic dice known as sexual reproduction, makes possible the process of evolution as the second direction that energy can lead us to. Evolution and entropy are not absolute opposites, but opposing tendencies of growth and dissolution, complexity and chaos. Between the two, we might look for a measure of dynamic balance, of homeostasis, that is, an active state in which the change within the system allows the system to maintain itself in a seemingly unchanging fashion. And so, in short, between entropy and evolution, I've placed equilibrium. So having established that energy is the starting point for our E-world, we can add that it moves in three directions: entropy, equilibrium, and evolution. The three directions of energy all involve the dimension of time, and Einstein's move from matter to energy also involved a shift from a physics that viewed the universe in absolute terms of a timeless space to a relativistic physics in which all phenomena are events in space-time. For this reason, I place events at the center of E-world. The dimension of time is missing from Euclidean geometry and Newtonian physics and from Aristotelian logic as well. Factoring time into the equation was a process that occurred in many different ways, from the calculus of Gottfried Leibniz and Isaac Newton to the cubism of Pablo Picasso. It includes the historical consciousness that began to emerge in the 18th century and Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection in the 19th century. It includes a renewed emphasis on sound, acoustic space, and secondary orality that, as discussed by McLuhan and Ong, is associated with the introduction of electricity, electrical technology, and the electronic media. It includes Korzybski's general semantics and the linguistic relativism of Edward Sapir, Dorothy Lee, and Benjamin Lee Whorf, especially Whorf's argument that Hopi and Navajo languages, with their emphasis on verbs as opposed to nouns, represents a metaphysics that's consonant with Einstein's non-Newtonian physics. Now, inspired by this, Buckminster Fuller described himself by saying, "I seem to be a verb." And the scholar of Kabbalah, David A. Cooper, elaborated on the idea that God is a verb. Now, media ecology, being time-oriented, has been associated with the study of effects, especially the effects that innovations have on societies and individuals, and generally with effects resulting from changes made to systems. And systems theory has been associated with the concept of emergence, which refers to the new phenomena that emerge out of systems as a consequence of the relationship of their parts, and that systems themselves sometimes emerge out of the interaction of their parts, organizing themselves spontaneously. So emergence and effects are both types of events resulting from the tendency of energy to move in the direction of entropy, equilibrium, or evolution. At this point, I think it's necessary to incorporate human subjectivity into my E-world model as we move down from events to again split into three directions. The first is experience, which represents the individual's relationship to reality. The relationship between events and experience corresponds broadly to Korzybski's model of the process of abstracting, which he referred to as the structural differential. At the top of the model is the event level, while experience would encompass all the rest of the model. Experience is a subjective phenomenon, but subjectively, we tend to perceive our environment as being made up of objects, and this opens the door for the concept of objectivity and for objectification. We're in the habit of relating to phenomena as things, and general semantics represents an attempt to put us closer in touch with the world as events in space-time. Now, experience here corresponds to what Martin Buber refers to as I-it relationships, which he contrasts with the I-thou or I-you relations. That is, our relations with other human beings insofar as we treat them and regard them as fellow human beings. And I've represented that element here by the term empathy, because that's what language and symbolic communication unlock in us. The ability to feel for others, to imagine what it's like to experience the world as others do, and to see ourselves as others see us. To understand empathy, we have to draw upon the symbolic interactionist perspective of George Herbert Mead and Irving Goffman, the humanist psychology of Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, and the relational approach of Gregory Bateson, Paul Watzlawick, and Deborah Tannen. And as we move from the monologic of experience to the dialogic of empathy, the next step over is to ecologic, that is, to ecology. Now, I use ecology in this model to represent the complexities of interactions among many different people, the many different people that make up our social lives. Ecology represents our social networks, including family and friends, neighbors and communities, professional affiliations and amateur associations, and societies and cultures. And so to understand ecology, we need to turn to the work of scholars such as Lewis Mumford, Harold Innis, Eric Havelock, Jacques Ellul, Elizabeth Eisenstein, Denise Schmant-Besserat, and of course McLuhan, and Postman. Now, experience, empathy, and ecology are not isolated elements, but rather are very much interactive with each other. So that, for example, our relationships influence the way that we experience the world and abstract reality. And the three aspects of human subjectivity converge once again, together constituting our environment. Korzybski described his perspective as that of the organism as a whole in an environment, and the inclusion of environment here also serves as a reminder to maintain a holistic perspective and a systems orientation. And McLuhan emphasized the fact that we're actively engaged with our environments, influencing and altering them, creating entirely new human environments, and being shaped and molded in turn by them. Environment, then, is properly located at the base of this e-world model. The 9 elements identified so far have been arranged in a hierarchical fashion, but I want to emphasize that they're all connected to one another, all interconnected to form a complete system. And underlying all of these elements as the foundation of the model is the simple fact of existence. Or to draw on general semantics once more, we might just call it etc., by which we mean everything else. But I use existence here to signify the fact that this model cannot help but be informed by existentialism. It's very much concerned with the basic question of human being, human existence. Existence, then, needs to be located at the foundation of e-world. Now, for those of you of a spiritual bent, we can crown the model on top with Elohim, which is the Hebrew word for God. And this covers the monotheistic religions. And if any of you are pagans, neo-pagans, animists, and the like, I'll just point out that although Elohim is translated as God, grammatically it's a plural noun, so it covers polytheism as well. Now, some students of Kabbalah embrace a less than personal concept of the divine or supernatural, an understanding of Elohim as the Ein Sof, or the infinite, and that's consonant with forms of Eastern spirituality and mysticism. And Elohim can also serve as a metaphor for the transcendental quality of nature, as it did for Baruch Spinoza, a founder of the Enlightenment. And it can simply stand in for our sense of awe and wonder at the universe, for our wonder at the mysteries of life and death that we may never solve. And in the words of Albert Einstein, the most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It's the source of all true art and science. He to whom this emotion is a stranger, who can no longer pause to wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead. His eyes are closed. Now, taken as a whole, this model for e-world resembles the tree of life diagram of the Kabbalah. And I didn't set out to construct a model on that basis, but as I was working on it, it just quite naturally fell into that archetype. So perhaps in place of the Kabbalistic tree of life, what we have here is the E of life. Now, one difference between the two is that the tree of life has 10 elements, known as the Sephirot, which represent 10 aspects of the divine, the 10 media, if you like, of the infinite. But this E of life doesn't stop at 10 elements, but goes up to 11. Thank you. And maybe that's only fitting to go up to 11, but there is a way to solve the incongruity. Using the Kabbalah as inspiration, we can consider existence and Elohim as two aspects of the same element, not two separate elements. And in doing so, connect the top of the model to the bottom of the model in circular, spherical fashion. Now this is only fitting for E-world, given that electricity requires a circuit. Einstein's non-Newtonian physics established that space is curved, and heck, even Aristotle knew that the world is round. So, look, the original Tree of Life legend was said to exist in the Garden of Eden. As you may recall, there was a bit of a snafu back in Eden concerning Eve, and involving Adam and an apple. I don't know if it was a Macintosh. But that brings us back to the beginning, not just back to Genesis, but back to A. And the apple came from the tree of knowledge, not the tree of life. And the A of the alphabet and the A of Aristotle's logic represent innovations of the greatest importance in our ability to obtain and maintain knowledge. Having eaten of the apple and gained that knowledge, it's now time for us to move on to the next stage. And that's not a return to the past, not a step back to Eden as a golden age, and it's not a step up to Eden as the afterlife. Rather, it's time for the creation of a new Eden, right here, right now, on E-World. Thank you. So, time for questions? I don't know if I do. Sure. Or not.
It's time for questions. There's a microphone up there, or you can just speak loud. If I'm on it.
You don't question performance.
Didn't you just measure the tree of life at 10?
What's that?
Oh
Sorry.
man, you missed the Spinal Tap reference. I said, didn't you just measure the tree of life at 10?
Oh, I see. Yeah.
It's one louder, man.
Yeah.
Okay, what about E prime?
What about it?
Well, you got the scheme. I'm
Yeah.
curious.
Well, of course, E prime is, well, that actually fits in nicely, right? Because for those of you who are not familiar with it, Korzybski wrote about the problems of is. I'm pretty sure that Bill Clinton was somehow informed by general semantics when he said, it depends on what the meaning of is, and it was actually a very sensible statement to make from that point of view, but of course almost no one understood that, and almost everyone understood he was just being evasive anyway. But Korzybski was not absolutely opposed to the use of the verb to be, but he pointed out that there were problems with it because we tend to think of it as tantamount to equals and turn it into an equation, and it leads us, nothing is identical to anything else. That the idea of identity relations is a fundamental problem that comes to us because we use symbols. We use symbols and they suggest that anything that is given that name is the same as anything else, or even that, the fact that you call me by the same name now and you call me by the same name tomorrow suggests that I'm not somehow different, living in a different time, and that things haven't changed. So it suggests a kind of unchanging reality. But some folks who followed after Korzybski decided to create or to try their hand at English without the verb to be, to totally eliminate the verb to be from their writing. I don't think anyone tried to do it from speaking, because it would just, I don't know how you would do it. But with writing, where you can sit down, you can, as you said, view and review and edit it, you can do that. You can write a text and not use the verb to be at all. In fact, it's as a general exercise, it works very well in livening up your writing. Nothing is as deadly as the verb to be. So that was, E prime means English prime, right? That is English without the verb to be. And there were a few anthologies put out. I myself tried it once. Right after Postman passed away, I was asked to write a piece about him, etc. And I don't know, just somehow to make things more difficult, I decided to write it in E prime, except for the quotes I used. I'll never do that again. But I think the fact of the matter is that it fits in nicely with the E-world model, because the idea of E prime is to remind us, to get away from using the verb to be, and therefore to remind us that the world is dynamic and changing, that it's energy rather than objects, rather than things. So, good. Thanks. Okay, another question. I'm going. Yeah.
So the medium is the message, and you've been very playful with the letter E, and is that the message of the ecology? And the second part is, what do you think of visual aid did to us?
What do I think?
Your PowerPoint did to us in darkness.
What did your PowerPoint do to us in darkness?
What does my PowerPoint do?
What did it do to us in darkness?
In darkness?
What was the effect of your visual aid?
Yes.
Well, and first of all, it relieved you of the burden of looking at me. Well, I'm going to take the speaker's prerogative of answering a different question than the one who asked. And I will note that what really makes a difference, and I've seen this, we actually interviewed somebody a few years ago for a senior position, and he came in with a PowerPoint, and he just given it at Annenberg, at the University of Pennsylvania, in like a stage like this with a giant screen, and when you do that, you feel like, wow, I'm really cool and powerful and all that. And we sat down in a little conference room, and there wasn't even any projection, so he had to take his laptop and show it to us. And so, really, the venue and the size of the screen makes all the difference. And with that, one of the reasons for turning it down is that there are a few points where the slides, I have it keep going even though I'm not speaking. And when I did it the first time, there were a few people who, for some weird reason, were looking at me rather than the screen, haven't been trained well, and so missed some of that. So that was what that was about. Okay.
Nancy, I love when you said if we did what we were supposed to do, we wouldn't be media ecologists. So how does the E-world model fit into that?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's hardcore scholarship. It's just trying to play around with ideas and just get the thought process flowing. But another thing, it's actually a good question because On the one hand, we have Korzybski, and I mean, Corey and I have talked about this, and Korzybski was obsessed with creating a system, trying to systemize everything, and with that, then to be able to teach it to the, common people, not just, to work with scholars and academics. And there's something to be said for that, but a lot of folks in media ecology, I mean, I actually consider system to be a dirty word or a bad term. That systems, the move towards systems, and it goes back to Copernicus, it goes back to print culture, represents a turn to visualism, to using diagrams instead of dialogue in communication. And it has this tendency to close things off rather than dialogue being the sort of opening. So it certainly wasn't an approach that Ong would favor, nor McLuhan, although he did get into that tetrad stuff, so I mean there's a bit of that. Postman would never have been into this, and as Chris Nystrom would always say, media ecology isn't an ism, right? We're not that, and I would go along with that. Any attempt to really try to systematize it is doomed to failure because it's an open system. It's just, constantly you follow one thread to another, constantly doing that. But every so often it's fun to play with that. When I started that freshman course I took with Jack Garland, we spent a lot of time on models of communication, right? The Shannon Weaver model, the Berlow model, the Wesley McLean model. I think maybe a few of you know what I'm talking about. And it was an interesting kind of effort to try to diagram it out. And a lot of it, you can see, traces back to diagrams of electrical circuitry and later computer flow charts. It's a different way of thinking. So I think that kind of goes against expectations. And I would just say, I wouldn't say to take this that seriously, but just as a way to, what does work for me, what I think is important about media ecology is the idea to try to think big, to try to really go for the grand unified theory or go for the models and the concepts that bring everything together. I mean, a lot of our people, McLuhan and Ong, were concerned with the entirety of human history, what it means to be human. Postman as well, and it was also, what does it mean to be human? Louis Mumford, Jacques Ellul, and taking a step back to systems-oriented folks like Gregory Bateson, for example, and like Korzybski, and some of us, like Bob and Corey and I working on some of these things, is to even ask the larger question about the nature of the universe, whether it's scientific or philosophical, and just try to find a way to put it all together. And I think most other approaches, they just don't do that. I mean, for me, one of the problems with Marxism as an approach, well, there's important contributions, but it only works from the Industrial Revolution onward. It doesn't explain feudalism very well. It has nothing to say about oral cultures. I was at a conference about a Walter Ong conference, and they had one of the speakers was a psychotherapist just talking about talking, and I asked, how would you psychoanalyze a member of an oral culture? Could you? And he didn't have an answer. These approaches can't take in the entirety. So what attracts me about media ecology and all these ideas is that we can kind of put together an idea about how everything fits together. And that for me is the model, even though I'm playing around with E and maybe playing a little fast and loose, it's the idea that everything can fit together. It does make sense. Hey, Sheila.
Can I ask something more segues to what you were saying than the presentation necessarily? Having had a 10-year tenure as sort of head of MEA, and since we've just begun this convention, how has it changed from its beginning? What do you see are the differences or the drifts? I'm just curious, sort of that long-term picture of media ecology.
since the beginning of the Media Ecology Association. Oh, I've gotten older. One of the sort of the demographic shift is, when we started out, I always said we're an international organization where most of our members are from the New York area, and then that's changed a lot. And I think some of the, when we started out, a lot of it was still still working from the tradition of McLuhan and Ong and Postman, and Ong and Postman were still alive when we started out. And it's over this course that I think we've sort of gotten a better idea of the field as a field. We've done that kind of work to get a sense of that, and also just broadened out. I mean, become more international, gotten more different points of view, and incorporated more ideas. I think what Eric McLuhan introduced with formal cause, which I wanted to work in here, but I decided it would be too far, going too far. But that has brought some important ideas into the fold as well.
After Eve, it comes F.
We're sticking with vowels. Which is spiritual, by the way. I know David Abrams says it in The Spell of the Sensuous. I don't know if he originated it or if it came from someone else, but the name of God in the Bible, which is Yod-He, Vav-He, is 4 vowels, that it's all breath, Yahweh. He forgives me. I get dispensation. It's all, it's all vowel, it's all breath. Consonants are not breath; they're the shape of the mouth. So vowels are big. Is that Barry?
Yeah. You mentioned Edison, and you had that. You said something that wasn't ethical, and I guess I was wondering what you meant by that.
Well, Edison was like a bastard, and he stole a lot of patents or a lot of inventions. He was a very he actively tried to squelch competitors. He just was not a nice guy. It's really disturbing to learn about these peoples. It's better not to. Samuel Morse, was the inventor of the telegraph. He was a racist and anti-Catholic. And I was just, a couple of years ago, I was in Italy, and I was a guest of the Marconi Foundation, and they have like this big tomb of Marconi, outdoors. It's like this giant coffin, and on the wall behind, written in Italian, is a quote about Marconi's great historical importance. And who was the quote from? Mussolini, who Marconi supported. So it's best not to know these things sometimes. But on the other hand, it does mean we shouldn't glorify them too much. And I guess also understand that inventing something doesn't mean you're a person of good character. Just as being a scholar, being a writer, being an artist, it doesn't. Those are separate. You still have to work at being a good person, or you get dumped from the slideshow.
I'm curious to know if you've done any work with Alfred North Whitehead. You mentioned him in the context with Bertrand Russell, but certainly after that he went on to construct a kind of metaphysic that your presentation was a really interesting summary of in some ways. I don't know if you've had exposure across the reality, but the ideas that he's working with in there connect very nicely with what you were talking about.
Yeah, I have a bit, but it just seems to run across so many folks at this period, this moment in time. For this, I was certainly working with Korzybski, and I recommend it. It's a crazy book, Science Insanity. I remember Postman talking about it, and once saying that it's brilliant, but also like horribly written. But it is kind of fascinating to go through because it was from 1933, and he's really anticipating systems theories and incorporating all these ideas about structure and relationship as the idea that we have no direct contact with reality. We just receive stimuli through our nervous system. It's like, light hits the retina, it irritates the retina, that sends pulses, electrochemical pulses through the nerve endings, and something goes on in the brain to build up the picture of the world. But theory of logical types has just sort of like been picked up in a number of places, but Postman, when he originally introduced media ecology, had that in mind as one element, and it comes up in a number of other places.
Well, beyond logical types, Whitehead goes on to create a metaphysic of the event. That's what his magnum opus really is.
Sure.
Which is what you were.
Yeah, but absolutely. But I think just going back to, I think Einstein is the beginning of that, and so. But I'm all for Whitehead. Yeah.
So from a little bit of Postman that I've read, he seems very cautious about this transition from the A world to the E world and its implications on our culture. Whereas your presentation seemed a little more optimistic or about the E world, or I guess excited about the E world. So I just wanted to maybe speak to that a little bit about what you think, how you think this transition will affect the culture in general.
Who was it? It was a media college. We used to have in-house conferences in our doctoral program with, my first one, they had Mumford and Havelock. I think it was Eric Barnell, who said like on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays and Sundays I'm optimistic, and on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays I'm pessimistic. So, I tack back and forth between the two, and the book I'm working on now, Amazing Ourselves to Death, is taking Postman's view and really just raising the questions of, to what extent is his critique still valid, and really it still is, even more so in light of cable television and the internet and so forth. But I think we have an opportunity as well. There's a lot of sort of pessimism, but we don't have, I don't think anyone, a little bit, but even a little is not totally fatalistic about it all. That we have the potential to make things better if we work at it. Part of it was simply part of it was, and I think Postman would agree, that our understanding of what's going on has been enhanced by the new technology, that it's helped to bring an awareness of media and its effects into our consciousness. Now that may be just because we're dooming ourselves, but awareness is the first step, and then the idea of, can we steer this in some way, and to make it positive, or if not that, to make it not as harmful as it could be. I think it's just try to tack between the two, and you find the truth somewhere in between.
Also, maybe you talk about where in the system a word that kind of dominated scholarship for the latter half of the 20th century, that's power. One of the things I have problems with Korzybski is I think that over the years of region that if you figure out the whole system, then we can just program it, build a better mousetrap, and everything will work out. Not that, people won't take those for that system for people in.
Right. Well, I mean, Korzybski did have some things to say about, the idea of empowering people by, that, and, it relates to the idea that symbols are the way that people are kept in line. And, if we can become aware of how symbols affect us. One of Korzybski's followers, Wendell Johnson, had the quote, to a mouse, cheese is cheese, and that is why mousetraps work. And to a human being, capital is capital, and labor is labor, and that's why propaganda works. So, I don't think that, he had some of that idea of trying to engineer things, but in his time, engineering was a positive word, and it's the idea of building, you could say building a bridge, right? That's not bad, we like that. Build a bridge, build a better tomorrow. I think that power relations are always a part of the technological environment, defined by the technological environment and the symbolic environment, and flow from that. Right? That's why we have revolutions, when those things change. When the technological environment changes, we can get a revolution. When the symbolic environment changes, rulers lose legitimacy, and we get changes as well. Are we done?
We're done.
All